Wait, how many dragons? This time on Scrolling Down the Belt, double. The answer is double. Yoshihisa Kishimoto delivered a big hit to Technos Japan with 1986's Renegade or Nekketsu Koha Kunio-kun. Naturally, the higher-ups wanted more and set Kishimoto to work on a follow-up immediately. But this time, Technos Japan had two very specific requirements. It should be a game with more international appeal, since Nekketsu Koha Kunio-kun did have to undergo its transformation into Renegade, and it had to be a game that allowed for two simultaneous players. After all, more players meant more money. Originally, Kishimoto envisioned this title as a direct sequel to Renegade with some new elements. But the more he thought about it, the more one of his favorite movies kept coming back to him for inspiration. Enter the Dragon, starring Bruce Lee. And I guess this is how Double Dragon was born. Well, maybe at least the name anyway? Instead of drawing on his own high school experiences like he did for Renegade, Kishimoto looked to the dystopian backdrops of popular media like Mad Max and Fist of the North Star. And maybe he looked to them a little too much. The story of Double Dragon goes something like this. It's the year 199X, and New York is controlled by violent gangs. Government and law have lost all power and people have to fight to survive. The Lee brothers, Billy and Jimmy, live a meager existence on the outskirts of town. They used to run a thriving chain of kung fu dojos in the heart of the city, but the world plunged into war 5 years ago, destroying their dojos and killing most of their students. Billy and Marion, the former assistant instructor of the women's division of their dojos, had fallen in love. But Jimmy secretly lusted after her. One day, Marion was kidnapped on the streets, and the Black Warriors, the biggest gang around, sent a letter to the brothers daring them to come and save her. The Lee brothers now head out to rescue Marion. Player 1 is Billy, and Player 2 is Jimmy. The game begins with quite an impactful scene, Marion being punched in the gut and hoisted over a thug's shoulder. Never mind the panty shot. But if you haven't read the manual or a story summary somewhere, there's no way you would even guess that the story was anything like this. You'd just think that Marion got kidnapped on a leisurely stroll through the slums, and Billy and Jimmy immediately came out of the garage to see what all the noise was about outside. Wait, wasn't Marion supposed to come over? I wonder where she's at. Oh, look, goons! The martial art that the Lees practice is called Sosetsuken, roughly translating to something like a pair of cutting fists. The Sosetsu here is also the same kanji compound that makes up the characters used in the title, Double Dragon, or Sosetsu Ryu. Anyway, it's a martial art which combines all of them? Its most well-known technique is called Senpu Kyaku, or Hurricane Kick. Where else have we heard that? Yeah, I know, Double Dragon came first. And even though Double Dragon was originally conceived as a sequel to Renegade, and is superficially similar, it's a huge leap forward. The screen on Renegade did scroll, but just a little bit left and right within the bounding boxes of its levels. You had a fairly limited area that you were moving around in. Double Dragon continuously scrolls to the right, urging the player to progress, even offering the ability to climb ladders or jump to move upward into certain areas. The transition between stages also happens in real time without any prominent title screens to break them apart, creating a much more movie-like experience. The control scheme is also much more intuitive than Renegade's was. You have a kick button, jump button, and a punch button. You automatically attack in the direction that you're facing, unlike Renegade, which had a button to attack in each direction, regardless of which you were facing. You can also jump in combination with the kick button to jump kick, which is a very important move to traverse pits and get up onto obstacles. Double tapping in a direction results in a headbutt, which proves to be fairly useless in pretty much any version of the game. Using the kick button at a further distance can also result in a hair grab, which you can make go into repeated knees to the face followed by a throw. You can even pick up a ton of different high-damaging weapons along the way from enemies. All of your favorites are here. We got boxes, oil drums, rocks, knives, whips, baseball bats, and even dynamite, which can take out enemies in a single explosion. But if you turn away from an enemy and press the jump and punch buttons simultaneously, you'll perform the godlike move that is the key to clearing the original arcade version of this game, the elbow. As you've seen, there are a lot of moves in Double Dragon, but rarely will you have a reason to use one that isn't the elbow. Yes, the elbow may not do much damage, but it takes priority over everything and just stays out there on the screen for a really long time. You can lock mostly every enemy down with it. All of the other moves are so easily interrupted by the enemy's own attacks, it just makes the game a much more difficult experience if you play it that way. The small handful of enemies that you're elbowing your way through have names though, don't be rude. You've got Williams, Roper, Linda, Abobo, what in the world is this guy eating? Jeff, and the final boss, Machine Gun Willie. I guess he's the leader of the Black Warriors because he's the only one who gets a gun. If you defeat Willie just as a single player, you'll rescue Marion and life is good. But if you're playing with a second player, Jimmy's desire for Marion becomes important because you now have to fight it out to see who rescues her. So much for reestablishing that dojo. And if you don't manage to defeat Willie or just die anywhere else in the game, you can just put in another coin and continue right there on the spot. I haven't really called this out so far, but none of the games that we've looked at up until now on Scrolling Down the Belt have allowed for this. You just go right to a game over screen once you lost all of your lives. The ability to continue like this would pretty much turn into a given. Also, look at this cat! Double Dragon has another big legacy outside of its more free-flowing belt-scrolling action and twist ending in two-player mode. The music. If the rockabilly soundtrack found in Renegade wasn't your thing, Double Dragon's soundtrack just might be. The Stage 1 theme in particular could probably be held up as one of the strongest video game tunes of all time, and these tracks have been covered in a variety of styles time and time again. Composer Kazunaka Yamane deserves just as much credit as Kishimoto, and he worked on the soundtrack for many of the early entries in the Double Dragon series. But though revolutionary, this game is far from perfect. If you find yourself playing an emulated version of the arcade game and thinking, God, this is so poorly emulated, look at all this slowdown. No, stop. Even the original board is plagued with slowdown in many areas, especially if you're playing with two players. Look at this absolutely crawl during the final boss fight. You can count those frames on one hand. Technos Japan's desire for an international hit was realized because Double Dragon was a huge hit worldwide. Though I was fairly young when it was new in arcades, I can tell you that it was everywhere in America in the late 80s. I first played it at my local 7-Eleven. Unsurprisingly, Game Machine magazine put it at #1 in its Best Hit Games 25 column in the July 1st, 1987 issue, and Capcom's 1943 only knocked it down to #2 later that month. But believe it or not, the arcade original may not be the most played version of Double Dragon. This title has a wealth of home ports, easily more than any title we've looked at so far on Scrolling Down the Belt, and probably more than any title that we ever will. There's probably even a version of Double Dragon that runs on your toaster. As usual, the most well-remembered and loved port is probably the one on the NES and Famicom, which was also the first to market, almost 1 year after the release of the arcade game. It was also developed by Technos Japan themselves, which makes how it turned out even more interesting. This port is very much in the school of thought that there's no real point in trying to recreate the arcade experience on the NES because the hardware is just not powerful enough. So let's make something completely new and different that's loosely based on the original. We kind of saw this with the NES version of Trojan, but Double Dragon takes things much further. Of course, the beat-em-up action is still here. You control Billy, not Jimmy, because this main portion of the game does not support two-player simultaneous play, and you move left to right and up and down on the screen in true belt-scrolling action game fashion. But you'll quickly discover that at the beginning you can only punch and kick. You can also jump, but you can't jump kick? No elbow? No hair grab? Now hold on, these things are all here. They're just hidden behind a level-up system. Each attack gives you a certain amount of points when you perform it, and these points result in the stars at the bottom of the screen going up. When you get a star, you gain a level, and you get a new move. Level 2 ends your punch combos with an uppercut or your kick combos with a roundhouse. Level 3 gives you the jump kick. Level 4 allows you to do the hair grab. 5 gives you this ground punch. 6, the elbow, though don't get too excited because it's not so powerful here. And 7, the ultimate technique of the spinning hurricane kick at the end of your combos. Some of these moves give you no experience points though, such as the elbow. So really the best way to attack in general is to kick from as far of a distance as you can, so that you can potentially go into the hair grab, kick up to 4 times, and then throw them. You'll get no seamless transitions between levels in this version, but you get the awesome between level music to make up for it. Many of the level layouts are pretty wildly different from the original game, which again reinforces that they absolutely were not going for a one-to-one recreation. They even added a brand new enemy, Chinese martial artist Qin Taimei, but poor Jeff got kicked to the curb. This port has no continues, meaning that when you burn through your lives, that's it. And this is only potentially a problem because of one thing: the NES version's huge emphasis on platforming and obstacle avoidance. Because of these moving platforms, you're going to be jumping about 200% more than you would in the original, and with this jump, it kinda sucks. It's doable once you get the feel and timing of it down, though. What's even worse is having to dodge these randomly falling stalactites, and also you have to go through this door in the 3rd level or else you'll just repeat it. Double Dragon shouldn't have mazes! Of course, in the final level, the stupid blocks coming out of the walls are back from the arcade version, but they did get rid of the spear-thrusting statues, so thanks, I guess. If you can survive this gauntlet, you're still fighting Machine Gun Willie. But after you beat him, you fight Jimmy! Since this isn't a 2-player version of the game, this isn't the same thing where you're competing for Marion. He just decided to turn evil and lead the Black Warriors. But there is a mode that does support 2-player simultaneous play, Mode B. Here, very much like the NES port of Trojan, you can play a sort of versus fighting game with another player, including most of the enemy characters. These are all unique sprites, and this is the only place in the game that they exist. It's not all that fun to play, since you can only use a couple of different attacks and you both have to play as the same character, but it's a really interesting curiosity that's unique to this NES version. Famitsu editors scored the Famicom port a fantastic 31 out of 40, earning it a Silver Award. The readers of Famimaga also gave it a 20.81 out of 30. The second most well-known port of Double Dragon is probably the one that came to Sega's Mark III and Master System in the later part of 1988. This version was actually developed by Arc System Works, which is funny because as of the release of this video, they're the current rights holders to Technos Japan's properties, and have been since 2015. And even though the characters look a lot like the designs found in the NES version, this one attempts to stick much more closely to the original arcade game. It also supports 2 players simultaneously, which made it the favorite home version of Double Dragon for many players back in the day. Assuming you own a Master System, of course. There's no RPG elements or leveling here, just good old-fashioned punching and kicking. It's a very solid version, but the 2-button Master System controller was not really up to accurately emulating this 3-button arcade game. Hitting both buttons together does the jump kick, which means the elbow corresponds to hitting the D-pad in the opposite direction that you're facing and the punch button at the same time. It doesn't sound that bad, but it makes it a lot harder to pull off, and not to mention the elbow just doesn't seem to be as effective here. Jump kicking and using weapons seem the way to go instead. Naturally, Double Dragon also came out on a handful of Western computer platforms, such as the Amiga, Amstrad, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum. There was a version on the Atari 2600, and I mean, I know this is the 2600, but the enemies are extremely aggressive in this version though, so I did not get very far. But the 7800 also had a port which certainly nailed the look and feel of the game a whole lot better, and you can still elbow your way to victory. The 1990 Game Boy version was also Technos Japan developed, and it's once again its own unique creature. Your moveset is a bit more pared down, featuring only the punch, kick, a very floaty jump kick, elbow, throw using the punch button up close, and hair grab using the kick button up close. There's no NES version leveling gimmicks here, you get all your moves from the start. And at first, this version seems like a cakewalk. Roper, Williams, and Linda can barely even touch you. But once you get to the bosses, which is to say Abobo and Shin Taime in various quantities and arrangements, you're better off just sticking to punches because kicks seem to be way less effective. And given that they often throw multiple Shin Taimes at you at once, this version is deceptively difficult. Machine Gun Willie is still the end boss, but as long as you let him fire off some rounds every now and then, he's no big deal. Even though you have the floaty jump kick to help you, the real last boss of this game is the even greater amount of platforming that they've added to it. Stop making me jump on platforms in Double Dragon! Ah! This Game Boy version is interesting since it's just so different, but ultimately it doesn't feel quite as full-featured as the NES or arcade versions. Famitsu editors scored this one a mere 27 out of 40, and Famimaga readers gave it a 20.78 out of 30. There was a version for the Genesis/Mega Drive that was released in 1992 and was developed by Software Creations. This port only came out in the US and Europe, not Japan. And despite good intentions, I can kind of see why. To be fair, this is easily the most faithful port to the arcade game, visually speaking. But they've dramatically changed how the moves work. It's like they saw the elbow, recognized how powerful it was, and purposefully nerfed it. The enemies can actually duck it, like they do jump kicks in Renegade. The hit detection is also just generally kind of bad and weird. And it moves so fast. Points for really swinging for the fences and replicating the original, but I can't really recommend this port. The Game Gear also got Double Dragon in 1992, developed by Virgin Games, once again only in the West, and what the hell am I playing? This is Double Dragon in name only and doesn't look or feel anything like any other version of the game. I think they were trying to do something that played more like a budget version of Sega's Streets of Rage, just using the Double Dragon name. Yuck. The Atari Lynx version came out in 1993, and they nailed the graphics, but my god is this zoomed in! A jump kick just sends you scrolling up the screen like crazy. Next! But actually, there were no new ports of Double Dragon 1 for the next 10 years. It was revived with 2003's Game Boy Advance release of Double Dragon Advance. But this version is probably going to get covered in a future episode because it's quite different in that it combines elements from the later Double Dragon games as well. Then in 2007, we got yet another port. You see, at this point, the Xbox 360 was young and it was one of the first consoles to have introduced digital storefronts, where you could buy digital-only titles that maybe didn't warrant a full packaged version. These were often either smaller games or remakes of older titles that a lot of people had nostalgia for. Double Dragon was one of the first to appear on Xbox Live, and yeah, it got the horrible early HD era treatment that a lot of these titles got, which didn't look good then and sure does not look good now either. Thankfully, you could still play with the original graphics. This game has since been delisted from the store, but at the time it sure was an accessible way to play the original Double Dragon. Today, there are so many ways to play the original, but the best is probably Hamster's Arcade Archives port, available on the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch Online stores. It's also on the Kunio and Double Dragon collection that's on pretty much all modern platforms, including Steam. But before we leave the ports, I have one honorable mention: the Neo Geo game. This is not at all a port of Double Dragon 1, but it has the same name and was developed by Technos Japan. This is actually a really cool fighting game with great character designs that was released in response to the 1994 movie. That's right, I said movie. There was a Double Dragon movie. It's an absolute disaster and not as endearing, at least in my opinion, as other similar fighting game to movie attempts like Street Fighter. Yoshihisa Kishimoto is even on record as saying, "I can watch it if I don't think of it as a Double Dragon movie. It's not really a Double Dragon movie." In a Polygon.com interview with Matt Leone, where this and his other quotes here are taken from, Kishimoto also notes that the main issue was that the people making the movie weren't in contact with the people who made the games. He said, I think having the two collaborate is the only way a game can be successfully made into a movie, and the bad Double Dragon media doesn't stop there. In fact, it had actually begun before the movie adaptation. There was a Double Dragon animated series that ran for 26 episodes from 1993 to 1994 and was produced by Deke Animation. But let's get back to Kishimoto. He also said that as a result of the success of the Kunio-kun and Double Dragon series, Technos Japan basically wouldn't allow him to work on any other franchises in the near decade that he was with the company. These were hit series, and they just needed more. This is one of the main reasons that Kishimoto later left Technos Japan, but the other was very interesting too. He said, also, over the years, the company made a lot of money and started spending it on real estate and even bought a racing team, so it was spending less and less on game development. Ultimately, I got fed up with the way it was handling its finances. Kishimoto also repeatedly mentions in this interview that one of Double Dragon's biggest problems was inconsistency, and that Technos Japan just didn't end up being good stewards of the franchise. We'll see this as we explore further entries in Scrolling Down the Belt. I'm not sure if this is a controversial opinion or not, but even though Double Dragon was undoubtedly the more successful of the two, I prefer the Kunio-kun series. Even though, at least at the time, it didn't necessarily translate to Western audiences well, it just has so much more identity. Also, though I despise the increased amount of platforming, I like the feeling of the NES Double Dragon in the hands more than I do the arcade version. Because this series has a big legacy, and boy oh boy, you're going to be seeing a lot more Double Dragon in the future. Next time on Scrolling Down the Belt, boy, those sprites sure are big.